Amen. Well, have you ever had a moment where everything good seemed possible, but one thing stood in the way? Maybe it was a raise at work, and there was that one factor, that one person, or that one circumstance that could affect that raise. Maybe it's a relationship, and you feel like healing and closeness are possible, but there's still that unresolved conversation. Or there's that one wound or that one fear that hasn't been dealt with. Maybe it's your health and things are improving and you're making changes. There's hope again. But there's that one test result, that one diagnosis, or that one lingering symptom that hangs over everything. Maybe it's a dream that God has put in your heart. And the doors, they seem to be opening, but there's that one obstacle that you just can't move yourself. Maybe it's freedom from a struggle or an addiction that you've battled with for years and you've made progress and you see growth, but there's still one pattern, one habit, one weakness that feels like that final barrier. Or maybe you're a Patriots fan. And it's that one game against the Broncos this afternoon. If we could just win in Denver, then all would be well and we'll be back on the biggest stage and competing in the Super Bowl. There's that one hurdle. We all know, right, what it feels like to stand so close to something good and yet feel like there's that one small piece that holds the whole future in the balance. Today, as we complete our sermon series in the book of Ruth, that is the question that is hanging above the story, this final chapter in this wonderful, beautiful story. There's one final thing that stands in the way. Now, if you haven't been with us over the past few weeks, or maybe if you've forgotten, let me just catch you up so far on what's happened. In chapter 1, we opened up the story with a man named Elimelech, a man whose name literally meant God is my king, but his choices, they told a different story. Instead of seeking provision and safety from the Lord, our story showed us that he turned to Moab to meet his needs. He went to a land that was marked by idolatry and that was marked by people who opposed God's people. His decision to trust in Moab rather than to trust in God, it led his family to a lot of brokenness. And ultimately to his own death and the death of his two sons, and then finally the departure of one of his daughters-in-law named Orpah. At the end of the day, what was left of the family, you might remember in chapter 1, was that all that was left was Elimelech's widow, Naomi, and his other daughter-in-law, Ruth. And as Naomi decided to return to Bethlehem, Ruth decided to follow her, right? And while her mother-in-law was full of bitterness, Ruth was full of hope. Hope in Yahweh, the God of Israel, the one that she had just placed her trust in. And then we got to chapter 2, and chapter 2 is where we were introduced to another character. But this time, this character wasn't like Elimelech. This time, this character was very different. His name was Boaz. He was described as a worthy man, a man whose life showed that he really did, in fact, trust in God. And his character reflected the character of the one that he worshiped. And God led Ruth, right, to glean in a field that was owned by Boaz. And then she ran into Boaz. And when she ran into Boaz, he treated her with a generous amount of kindness. And he provided for both Ruth and Naomi with tremendous amounts of food and also social standing through the acceptance that he gave her. Chapter 2 showed us how Boaz proved to be a man who was noble, godly, and someone who had tremendous character, and someone who was an instrument of the Lord's care. And it ended with Naomi realizing that Boaz was actually one of the men in the community who could potentially redeem her and Ruth and remove all that stood in their family's way and restore all that their family had lost. And then we got to chapter 3. And in chapter 3, Pastor Kevin showed us how Ruth approached Boaz and asked Boaz to consider taking responsibility for her and Naomi. And in this beautiful moment, Boaz agreed, and he did it in a wonderful and pure type of way. And Pastor Kevin explained that Boaz, when he agreed to do this for these women, it was all pointing towards the greater reality of Jesus Christ, who would one day come and cover his people with grace. Now, despite Boaz agreeing to care for Ruth and Naomi, like we just said, chapter 3 kind of ended with this acknowledgement. Yes, I want to redeem them, but there's still one more thing that needs to happen. There's still one more hurdle. And we are left wondering, would this actually work out? And I don't know about you, but throughout the story, I have felt this love for Boaz develop and this love for Ruth develop. And as we were going through the story, as I read it each and every time, as you get to chapter 3, you have this tension, this question, will they wind up together? Will they actually be in a place where all will be made right? And that all brings us to our chapter today, chapter 4. Let's see how this beautiful story ends, and let's see how this question is answered. Ruth chapter 4. Let's start in verse 1. If you have your pew Bibles in front of you, it'll be on page 210 of the smaller pew Bibles. It'll also be up here for you on the screen. Ruth chapter 4. Let's see how this beautiful story ends. Hear the word of the Lord. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there. And behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, "Turn aside, my friend. Sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know. So there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you." And he said, "I will redeem it." Then Boaz said, "The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance." Then the Redeemer said, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it." Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other. And this was the matter of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself," he drew off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and to Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day." Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman." So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the woman said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Then Naomi took the child and laid on her lap, and took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Aminadab. Aminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Now, we have said it over and over again throughout this series, but this entire story points to the gospel. In fact, the character of Boaz, who's a real-life person, was someone that God worked through in a way that reflected how Christ, who would come to earth years later, cares for his people, how Christ cares for us. And with that in mind, as we walk through this text, the first thing that I think we need to notice is this: redemption comes with a cost. Redemption comes with a cost. Look with me at verse 1. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there. Now, if you're not familiar with the culture of the ancient Near East, the gate of the city or the town was not just an entrance. It was the center of civic, legal, and economic life. I want you to think about it this way. This was like the town hall, the courthouse, and the public square, all wrapped into one. It was a place where the elders of the community would gather, they would make judgments, and they would conduct official business. Contracts were made here. Disputes were settled here. Property exchanges were also made here. And everything that happened at the gate was binding. So when our narrator right here writes that Boaz goes up to the gate and sits down, he's not just describing an ordinary action for Boaz. This is Boaz being intentional. This is Boaz calling a community meeting where the elders are ultimately going to hear his case. If you want to see where this happens in other parts of the Bible, or where it's talked about in other parts of the Bible, you can turn to Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 19, or Joshua chapter 20, verse 4, or Proverbs 31, verse 23, talks about how the husband of a Proverbs 31 woman was someone who was well respected as an elder at the gate. Boaz, as he's going to the gate here, he is pursuing Ruth's redemption, but he has to go through the right process to do it, right? Now, you may remember from chapter 2 when we talked about chapter 2 and the idea of a kinsman redeemer was introduced, that in ancient Israel, this type of person, this kinsman redeemer, was a close male relative who was responsible to step in when a family member suffered severe loss or was placed in a vulnerable situation. For example, if the family had lost their land due to poverty, they had to sell it off or something like that, then the kinsman redeemer was expected to then step in and buy the land back so it could be kept for the family and preserved. Their inheritance could be preserved. Or if someone had to sell themselves into slavery to repay a debt, the kinsman redeemer was expected to come in and then purchase their freedom so that someone in their family could be free again, to keep them restored. In the case of a widow like Ruth, who lost her husband, the Redeemer was expected to come in, to marry her, to provide protection and care for her, and to help continue the family line by helping to raise up an heir. In light of all of that, Boaz, who has a desire to care for Ruth and Naomi in this kinsman redeemer type of way, is sitting at the gate and he's waiting. And he's waiting for the community to assemble so that he can do something that he knows is so important, that's so good, that's so honorable, and that these women need so desperately. And while he's sitting, our text says, suddenly, the elder, the one who's first in line, just happens to walk up. And he grabs him quickly and he pulls him to the side, and then he says to 10 other elders as he can grab them, "Come and be my witnesses." And with 10 witnesses present, that means the meeting has begun. The session has officially been initiated here in the city of Bethlehem. And verse 3 shows us that Boaz has already talked to Naomi about what the plan is, right? He's already come up with the way in which they're going to present everything. Look with me again at verse 3. This is what he says to the first redeemer. Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling a parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one beside you to redeem it, and I come after you. Boaz is being really smart about this, right? He knows that this first redeemer understands the law and understands that he is responsible to buy back this land and to hold it for Naomi's heir. But he also knows that this first redeemer looks at Naomi and sees that she is advanced in years and she's probably not going to have another heir. And so he knows that the first redeemer is looking at this like an opportunity to grab some land. Because he knows if she doesn't have an heir, the land will be his. And he will just grow in this property acquisition. So Boaz is essentially saying here, here's an opportunity for you to get more land. I would do it, but according to the law, you're first in line. He's being sneaky. He's being clever. He's being smart. Boaz is setting this guy up. And the first redeemer, he gets excited and he says, I'll do it. I'll redeem it. But then Boaz brings the hook. Something that the first redeemer didn't know about and that reveals his character. Look with me again at verse 5. Then Boaz said, the day that you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. Now this changes everything for the first redeemer because he now realizes that this complicates things. He would be financially responsible not just for one other person, but now for two other people. And he would also need to help this young woman who still is in her childbearing years to be able to produce an heir, which then means that when that son is raised up, he would not be considered the son of this first redeemer, but he would be considered the son of the house of Mahlon, of Elimelech. And all that property that he just spent his money on would go to that son. Would not be given to him and to his estate, but would go to that son. To say it simply, the first redeemer realizes he's going to have to spend a lot of money, and it's going to mean that his estate is ultimately going to be worth less at the end of the day. This whole redemption is going to be very costly for him. Even though these women are so desperate, even though they need care in a way that they can't provide for themselves, even though this is the honorable and right, godly thing to do, the first redeemer was not willing because the price was too high. The first redeemer quickly changed his tune and said this in verses 6 and 8. Read with me in verses 6 and 8. I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. And then in verse 8, the redeemer said to Boaz, buy it yourself. He wanted the blessing without the burden. He wanted the field without the family. He wanted the benefit without the cost. This is exactly what Boaz was expecting and in some ways hoping for, because it cleared the way for him to take responsibility for Ruth and Naomi. You see, brothers and sisters, there is a cost to redemption in the ancient Near East. There is still a cost to redemption now. For Boaz, it meant a shift from comfort and convenience to complicated care. For Boaz, it meant that he would have to extend his time and energy. For Boaz, it meant that he would have to sacrifice his money and his life plans. And yet, despite all that he would have to surrender, where the first redeemer withdrew his name from consideration, Boaz gladly agreed to step forward, knowing that when he did, he would save not just the lives of these two women, but he would rescue their entire family line. There's tremendous joy that can be found, brothers and sisters, when we are part of someone's restoration process, but only if we see them as valuable. And that's the case for Boaz. He sees these women as valuable. He sees the opportunity to preserve their family line as valuable. And so the cost doesn't matter. It's not high enough because that's more valuable. The value of caring for Ruth far outweighed the cost to Boaz. The second thing that we notice in this passage is that redemption becomes a witness. Redemption becomes a witness. And now as soon as Boaz finalizes the transaction and he takes off his sandal, I don't know if any of you have ever seen that before, but I'm actually glad we don't do transactions like that anymore, taking off our sandals and giving them to each other. But as soon as he does that and redeems the land that Naomi was selling, and as soon as he redeems Ruth and makes her his wife, where he promises to help restore the family line with an heir, something fascinating happens. Look with me at verse 11. Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem, and may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman." The entire community that's there, not just the witnesses, not just the elders, but all the witnesses, they not only agree to what they've seen, but they also publicly start to respond by testifying and by prophesying a blessing over Ruth. They have witnessed something incredible because redemption brings about a witness. They begin right by comparing Ruth to Rachel and Leah from the early days of the people of God. And when they do that, these witnesses are saying about this young woman, "We have seen her act with great honor." And it reminds us of some of the greatest mothers in our nation's history. And they express a desire for Ruth to have the same outcome as Rachel and Leah. Now, if you were to flip back to Genesis and look at this story with Rachel and Leah, you would see that they wound up to be nation builders. They had several children that helped to establish the house of Israel. And this is what they're prophesying over Ruth. They're saying, would she be responsible for building up God's people? And we're going to look at this later, but just how right were they? Way more right than they could ever have understood. Another woman that they mention here as they are speaking over Ruth and blessing her, as they are witnessing what they have just seen here, is Tamar. Now, if you were to look back at Genesis chapter 38, you would find that Tamar was someone who was initially not allowed to have justice. She wasn't allowed to have an offspring by her kinsman redeemer, but because she was clever and because God stepped in, she was able to get an heir through her kinsman redeemer. Tamar's story, if you were to look back on it, shows God's concern for the vulnerable women that are in our society and his commitment to them. And ultimately what happens with Tamar is she doesn't just have one heir, but she has twins. She has Perez and Zerah. And as we see at the end of the chapter, Boaz actually came from the line of Perez. You see, this is the breathtaking way that God works. While Boaz brought about justice for Ruth as a kinsman redeemer, the only reason that Boaz was alive to even do that was because someone generations back did it for him in his line. There was a gracious act of redemption in the line of Boaz, which then allowed him to do the same for Ruth. And the crowd of witnesses, they would know the story, they would know the line of Boaz, and they're picking up on that here, and so they're declaring this, may Ruth have the same care from God that her husband's ancestors had in the past. What the people are seeing in Ruth and what they're seeing in Boaz has moved them to celebrate the testimony of this wonderful act and this amazing union. You know, this is so true of so many moments of restoration, right? When we witness them, we can't help but keep continuing to talk about them. Several years ago, there was a man named Michael, and he walked into an ice cream shop in the city of Waltham. He was unhoused, and he was battling addiction. And in that ice cream shop, on the other side of the counter, there was a young college graduate who was a Christian. And she met Michael, and she invited him to start coming to church. And Michael showed up at church, and I just happened to be a part of that church. And I remember when Michael first came in, he was in rough shape. And the next several months, as other men in the church wrapped themselves around Michael and helped him, it was full of intensity. We shared the gospel with him. And we helped him with whatever he needed, and we got him into a recovery program. And after several months of being in that recovery program, Michael gave his life to Jesus. And then he came back to our church, and he was baptized with everyone in the church in attendance. And I got a picture of Michael right up there being baptized. Since that day, Michael has continued to do amazing things as he's followed the Lord. And I actually checked in on him about 6 months ago. This has been 15 years since that day. Michael's remained sober. He's gotten into stable housing. And he's even restored his relationship with his daughter. This restored life is something that I've heard so many people testify about. So many people praise God about. So many people stand up and bear witness to. Because Christ redeemed Michael from a life of brokenness and despair, and he still does that today. Redemption produces testimonies. Redemption becomes a witness. Third, what we see in this passage is that redemption leads to restoration. Look with me at verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Ruth was a widow. Now she's a wife. Ruth was barren. Now she has a son. Ruth was poor, but now she has been provided for. You see, God worked through Boaz and this act of redemption to reestablish for Ruth a beautiful life. And the author of this narrative here is so clear. It was the Lord who did this. It was Yahweh who allowed Ruth to conceive. It was Yahweh who allowed Ruth to give birth to a son. And all the way back, it was Yahweh who brought Ruth into that field where she met Boaz. God is the one who's restoring everything here for Ruth. But it's not just Ruth, right? This redemption also restored Naomi too. Look at verse 14. Then the woman said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer. And may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life, a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi," and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Naomi had lost everything in Moab. She had been filled with bitterness, with sadness, with despair, but now she was full of joy. She had been hungry and desperate, but now she was nourished. She had felt alone, but now she had a young woman who loved her. And even more than that, she had an heir. This is why Obed is placed in her lap, and it's said that a son has been born to Naomi. You see, Obed is called Naomi's son in Ruth 4:17 because in Israel's family and redemptive structure, this birth was not just about a baby biologically born to Boaz and to Ruth, but it was about restoring Naomi's entire family line and inheritance. The woman who said in chapter 1, "Call me bitter, change my name to Mara," is now holding a future that she never imagined. God didn't just fix her circumstances, did he? He healed her story. In essence, through this act of redemption, Naomi was reborn. The story had begun with her being hopeless, but then God stepped in and he made all things new. Redemption has a result, and it had a result for Ruth. It had a result for Naomi, but it also had a result for all of God's people, for the nation of God's people that would come afterwards. Look with me at verse 18. Now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Aminadab. Aminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David. The result of Boaz entering into the picture and Obed being born is that 2 generations later, the family line gave birth to King David, who was called a man after God's own heart, who was called a prince over his people. 1 Samuel 13:14. That means that Ruth the Moabitess, a young, seemingly insignificant woman from a humble estate, became the great-grandmother of King David. It was under King David that God's people were raised to their most glorious as a kingdom. Ruth has become a follower of Yahweh, the God of Israel, during a time of famine, in a time of the judges, where everyone did what was pleasing in their own eyes. And through this act of redemption that God brought about in her life, an entire nation was restored, and a majestic king was placed on the throne. But brothers and sisters, it gets way better than that. 31 generations after Ruth and Boaz held Obed in their arms, and 28 generations after King David ruled, another young, seemingly insignificant woman named Mary was wedded to a man of character, a just man, just like Boaz, and in fact a direct descendant in the line of Boaz, a man named Joseph. And under the stars, a young Mary gave birth to a baby boy, and she named him Jesus. And just like Obed brought about redemption for his family and his people, Jesus would do the same. But greater than Obed, Jesus didn't just preserve a family line. He created a new family made up of people from every nation. Greater than Obed, Jesus didn't just restore land. He restored and still restores hearts and minds and souls, the souls of his people. Greater than Obed, Jesus didn't just continue a family name. He gave us all a new name and a new identity. Greater than Obed, Jesus didn't just secure a future generation. He secured for us eternal life. Greater than Obed, Jesus didn't just establish a royal lineage. He fortified an eternal kingdom. Ruth's redemption in Bethlehem was only the start. In that same city, over 1,000 years later, the Son of God came to earth so that he might purchase us back from a life of darkness and brokenness, so that he might redeem us. And just like there was a cost to Ruth's redemption, there was a significant cost for us in the eternal redemption of our souls. That cost was Christ's very life. And just like Boaz acted willingly for the joy set before him, Jesus also didn't walk away, but he paid the price and he endured the cross so that we might be restored. And just like Ruth and Boaz's actions stood as a testimony, as a witness, what Jesus did to redeem his people echoes throughout the world, bearing witness to the majesty of God for eternity. And just like the result of Ruth's redemption was a new life for her and a family, in Christ's redemption, we too experience a new life and a family. And not just now, but forever. Brothers and sisters, you see, because our great Redeemer, Jesus Christ, defeated death, we too can know without a shadow of a doubt that even though we die, yet we will live again. John 11:25-26. Now, because all of what this story of Ruth points to is so true. Because you and I are redeemed. As a response, we have a call to take part in the redemptive story of God. Now, we're not asked to redeem souls, right? Only God can do that. But instead, we're called to step into the lives of everyone around us so that God's redeeming grace can be put on display, so that it can be seen, heard, and felt. And so, as you consider how you might do that this week, here's my encouragement. First, share the message of redemption. Be honest with your friends and family and neighbors about how Jesus paid the price for you so that you could be reborn and free. Psalm 107:2 says this, "Let the redeemed of the Lord say so, whom he has redeemed from trouble." And second, don't just declare it. Live it out. Live out what a redeemed life looks like. If you and I have actually been bought by the blood of Christ, then we belong to him. And as such, we should exude his character, his attributes of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Titus put it like this: Christ gave himself for us to redeem us from all lawlessness and to purify for himself a people for his own possession who are zealous for good works. Titus 2:14. May the words that we testify to our great, may the words we say testify to our great redemption, and may our great Redeemer and our great Redeemer, and may our lives that we live do the same. May the words we testify to our great redemption and to our great Redeemer, and may the lives we live do the same. Brothers and sisters, Jesus is our great Redeemer who brings life both now and forever. Jesus is our great Redeemer who brings life both now and forever. Let's pray.